The couple's retreat in Colorado was Myra's idea. She pitched it on a Tuesday in the middle of one of our routine dinners that had become less about connecting and more about going through motions. We were halfway through a barely seasoned pasta dish when she looked up and said, "I booked us a retreat. Just the two of us. It's in Colorado. 4 nights. Group therapy, hikes, no phones." I raised an eyebrow. "No phones?" She shrugged like it was nothing. "Yeah, that's the point. To disconnect from everything and reconnect with each other." It sounded like something from an infomercial. I should have asked more questions like where the sudden desire to reconnect was coming from, but I didn't. I nodded, smiled, and agreed. That was the pattern. She made the decisions and I went along with them. Somewhere along the line, I'd convinced myself that saying yes was easier than starting a conversation we both might not come back from. We flew out 3 days later and I tried to believe the best. Tried to see it as a chance to reset. Maybe that's what made the photo hit so much harder. It happened the first night. After we'd settled into our log cabin room and sat through a group dinner with 20 strangers trying to act like their relationships weren't falling apart. Mira had gone to the bathroom to take a long bath, complete with candles she'd brought from home, and I was setting up my tablet to read. The lodge had spotty Wi-Fi, but enough to sync files. I didn't expect anything unusual. That's what made it worse. The photo popped up with no warning. A cloud sync notification followed by a thumbnail. I clicked it out of habit. And then I stopped breathing. It was a parking lot somewhere suburban, judging by the surroundings. A strip mall in the background, the kind of place where you might grab a smoothie or drop off dry cleaning. And there was Mira, her arms wrapped tightly around a man. Tall, dark beard, hoodie. She was angled toward him, her lips brushing his cheek in a way that wasn't friendly. An asterisk mate. Comfortable. Familiar. The timestamp said it was taken 3 days earlier. 3 days. At first, I thought maybe it was an old photo that somehow got synced now. But then I remembered, I'd wiped and resynced her iPad myself last month when she locked herself out of her Apple ID. This wasn't old. This was new. My first instinct was denial. Maybe there was an explanation. Maybe it was nothing. But the feeling in my chest said otherwise. When she came out of the bathroom wrapped in a robe and humming like someone without a care in the world, I was still holding the tablet. I didn't say anything at first. Just turned the screen toward her. "What's this?" I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded. She blinked at the screen. Didn't flinch. Didn't gasp. Just sighed. "Oh, Caleb," she said, running a hand through her still damp hair. "That's for Monday. I ran into an old friend from college. Jeff. We hadn't seen each other in forever." I waited. "We hugged," she added, like I needed help interpreting what I'd clearly seen. It wasn't a big deal. I didn't answer right away. I was watching her, the way her tone had shifted. Calm, but just a little too controlled. "You kissed him," I said, not accusing, just observing. "On the cheek," she replied, as if that made all the difference. "It's a cultural thing. You know that." Mira wasn't European. She was from Ohio. "Look, if you're going to freak out every time I have a moment with someone, then what's the point of doing this retreat?" she said suddenly, her voice sharpening. "You know what? This is why we're here. Because you don't trust me. Because you build stories in your head and then punish me for things that aren't real." That was her tactic. She didn't lie, not exactly. She reframed. She rerouted. She turned every question into an attack and every defense into a performance. I knew this pattern too well. So I didn't argue. I nodded slowly, pretending to be satisfied with her answer. But something inside me had shifted. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was just done. Not with the relationship, not yet, but with pretending. I'd spent years giving her the benefit of the doubt, ignoring little red flags, forgiving without being asked. But that photo, it was the first thing I couldn't rationalize away. The rest of the evening passed quietly. She chatted with the other couples at the bonfire, laughing too loudly at someone's joke. I stayed mostly silent, watching her, trying to match the woman in the robe to the woman in the photo. I couldn't. Later, as we lay in bed with our backs to each other, I stared at the ceiling and thought about the way she hadn't asked me once if I was okay. Not even after showing her the photo. Not once. The idea of the retreat had seemed noble, even hopeful. But now, lying in a cabin full of strangers and silence, I realized something. Mira didn't want to save our marriage. She wanted to control the narrative. And for the first time in years, I wasn't playing along. The next morning, Mira was chipper. Too chipper. She woke early, brewed a pot of herbal tea, and suggested we go on one of the guided group hikes. "Fresh air helps clear the mind," she said, her voice light and easy. Like the night before hadn't happened. Like the photo hadn't existed. Like I hadn't seen the way her arms had wrapped around someone else's waist like they belonged there. I nodded along, pulled on my hiking boots, and said, sure, but my mind was already elsewhere. The truth was I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, that image reappeared, her cheek against his, her hand resting on his chest, her body language open in a way it hadn't been with me for years. I kept thinking about how easily she dismissed it. Not with fear, not with guilt, but indifference. That's what stung the most. As we hiked behind the group, her laughter drifted through the trees, too loud, too frequent. It was a performance for them, for herself, maybe even for me. But I wasn't clapping. That afternoon, while Mira attended a yoga session, I stayed behind in our cabin. I told her I had a headache. It wasn't a lie, just not the kind of headache she assumed. It wasn't physical, it was a pressure behind my eyes, like too many unspoken words were pressing up against the inside of my skull. I sat on the edge of the bed and started thinking. Really thinking. And for the first time in a long while, I let myself go there, into the archives of our marriage, into the places I'd sealed off and labeled not worth worrying about. Turns out there were a lot of those. Like her business trip to Tampa last spring. She said it was a conference. But when I asked what it was about, she got vague. When I offered to drive her to the airport, she insisted on taking an Uber. When I asked how it went, all she said was productive. There were no photos. No souvenirs. Not even a name dropped about who she met there. And then there was the night last October when I found her car parked 3 blocks away from our house, even though she always pulled into the garage. She said the garage door had jammed. But when I checked it, it worked fine. She laughed it off, said I was being extra. I remember the night she came home late smelling like aftershave. Not cologne, not the stuff I wore, but something heavier, more musky. I pointed it out. She shrugged. Probably just from the guy I sat next to on the train, she'd said. He was practically sweating Old Spice. She was always quick like that. Always had an explanation. Smooth ones. But they never included remorse. I thought about the dinners she bailed on, said she had meetings that ran late. But her calendar didn't line up. She'd never tell me who the meetings were with. Just work stuff, she'd say, waving it away like it didn't matter. And it didn't. Not to her. And now that I was truly letting myself look, I realized something Mira had always been hiding. Just in ways small enough for me to ignore. Her phone under her pillow. The way she always turned it face down. Her sudden need for privacy when we used to read each other's texts and laugh at memes together. There were new clothes I'd never seen her wear, receipts for lunches I didn't remember us having. The new perfume that she never wore around me. The one I'd found in the glove compartment, still in its box. Even the way she held herself had changed. Her posture. Her tone. She used to be soft around me. Comfortable. Now she was alert. Guarded. I had chalked it up to stress. Or aging. Or routine. I told myself all couples go through seasons. But now, sitting alone in a quiet cabin with only my thoughts for company, I realized I hadn't been in a season. I'd been in a fog. One that Mira had quietly, expertly maintained. I opened her side of the nightstand. Something I hadn't done in years. She used to keep crossword books in there. Maybe a sleep mask. Now it held a small journal. Plain black cover. I flipped it open, expecting grocery lists or affirmations. Instead, I found entries. Not pages and pages, just fragments. Sentences. Met Jay again today. Still feels dangerous but somehow safe. Am I just escaping or finally breathing? Caleb doesn't see me anymore. I don't blame him. I stopped reading after that. My fingers tingled. My ears rang. She'd been writing about him. Jay, the man from the photo. I didn't know how long it had been going on. Maybe months. Maybe longer. But it didn't matter. She had been writing about him while lying next to me. Later that evening, we sat around another fire with the group. Mira toasted a couple celebrating their anniversary. She told them how admirable their commitment was. She said she hoped we'd be just like them in 10 years. I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled. Nodded. Clinked glasses. But inside, something was splintering. Not shattering, not yet, but weakening. I could feel the fault line forming. She wrapped her arm through mine as we walked back to the cabin that night. Leaned her head on my shoulder like she used to. I feel good about this, she said. Don't you? I didn't answer. Because I wasn't there anymore. Not really. My body was walking beside her. But my mind was somewhere else. Rewinding tapes I had never wanted to watch. Watching old footage with new clarity. I realized I had spent years giving her the benefit of the doubt because I loved her. But I didn't know if I loved her anymore. And worse, I didn't know if I ever truly had, or if I had just loved who I thought she was. It was the 4th day of the retreat, and the air was colder than it had been. Frost lined the edges of the windows that morning, and the sky was heavy with clouds. Most of the other couples were dressed in layers, ready for the group hike scheduled that afternoon. I had planned to go. Mira had even laid out my jacket for me, something she hadn't done in years. A small, performative gesture, as if it meant anything now. I left the cabin quietly, told her I needed to stretch my legs before the hike. She smiled without looking up from her phone and mumbled something like, "Don't wander too far." I didn't. I stayed close enough to hear the truth for myself. The path behind the lodge weaved through tall trees and scattered pine needles. I wasn't walking with purpose at first, just letting my thoughts shuffle around like dead leaves. But as I looped around the far side of the main administrative building, the one where the staff ran their logistics, I slowed. There was a window half open. Voices drifted out. Laughter, specifically. Myra's laugh. I didn't mean to stop. I didn't even realize I had, until I was standing there in the thin brush, staring through a cracked sliver of glass into a private room that wasn't meant to be seen from the outside. There she was. And he was there too. The man from the photo. From the journal. Jay. They were alone. No staff. No facilitators. Just the two of them, seated close at a round table that held 2 steaming mugs and a folded retreat schedule between them. She was leaning in toward him, speaking softly. He laughed. She reached out, casually, instinctively, and touched his wrist. It was small, but it was everything. That moment confirmed everything I had been trying not to believe. And then, right there in front of me, she stood up, moved around the table, slipped her arms around his waist and tilted her head. He lowered his, and they kissed. Not on the cheek. Not a quick, platonic thing. It was soft, familiar, the kind of kiss people fall into, not stumble into. I didn't feel anger. Not in that moment. What I felt, strangely clearly, was stillness, like something had settled, as if all the guessing, all the denial had finally crystallized into fact. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make noise. I didn't want them to know I'd seen. I didn't want that confrontation. Not yet. I wasn't ready to watch her lie again. I wasn't ready to see her try to spin it. I walked until the trees swallowed me. I walked until I couldn't hear the wind or my own heartbeat. Somewhere along the ridge, I sat on a mossy rock and stared down into the valley. Everything below looked small, distant, like someone else's world. Hours passed. I don't know how many. I didn't track the sun, didn't check my phone. Just sat there in the cold, letting the numbness sink into my bones until it became part of me. I kept thinking, this is what truth feels like. Not like a punch or a scream, just quiet, heavy, immovable. I thought back to the first time I met Mira. How she used to tilt her head when she was curious about something. How she'd ask questions no one else thought to ask. She had this way of making everything seem like a story worth telling. Even me. Back then I'd felt seen. But now it was clear, whatever version of me she saw, it wasn't me. It hadn't been for a long time. When I finally returned to the retreat center, the sun was low and the temperature had dropped. A few couples were outside sipping tea near the fire pits. Mira wasn't among them. I slipped back into our cabin. It was empty. Her jacket was gone. Her shoes too. Probably out on another walk, or maybe she joined him again. I didn't check. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the knot in the wood floor beneath my feet. My body felt foreign, like a shell. There was nothing left to guess about. Nothing left to interpret. It was over. Not the retreat. Not the marriage officially. But whatever illusion I'd been clinging to, that was gone. I thought I might cry, but I didn't. I thought I might scream, but I didn't. Instead, I lay down on the bed fully clothed, stared at the ceiling, and whispered a single sentence aloud. I saw her. Not to anyone in particular. Just to the room. To the cabin. To myself. It made it real. I closed my eyes and let that reality settle. She was in love with someone else, or if not in love, then certainly not pretending to be faithful. And I had seen it with my own eyes. There would be no more second chances. No more stories about just friends or old connections. No more wondering if I was overreacting. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She made coffee, asked if I slept okay, told me the group was doing a shared journaling exercise by the lake, said it might be nice if we went together. I nodded and told her I'd meet her there, but I didn't go. I walked the opposite direction, further into the woods, further into myself. That evening, the clouds finally broke. Not with rain, but with wind-sharp, howling gusts that shook the old pine trees around our cabin and rattled the window panes. The storm had arrived in full, and with it, a sense of foreboding I couldn't shake. Mira was gone when I got back. Her coat, scarf, and phone were all missing. The room smelled faintly like eucalyptus and lavender, the scents she always layered together when she wanted to feel calm. I sat on the bed and waited. An hour passed, then another. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, screen lighting up with a message preview before fading again. I didn't mean to look, but the screen glowed long enough for the words to sear into my brain. Wish you were here instead. Last night wasn't enough. No name attached, just a timestamp, just 6 words, but each one pressed like a bruise on my chest. My stomach turned. I stood, pacing the narrow floor of the cabin like a trapped animal. The walls felt closer than usual, the silence louder. I told myself not to read into it, that it could be about anything, but deep down I already knew better. It was him, Jay. Whoever he was, whatever he was clearly more than an old college friend. The knock at the door startled me. It wasn't Mira. It was one of the retreat coordinators. He was young, early 20s maybe, wearing a windbreaker with the lodge's emblem stitched on the chest. His face was pale, nervous. "Mr. Langston?" he asked, voice thin against the wind outside. I nodded. "There's something you need to know. It's your son, Daniel. I'm so sorry. There's been an accident." My body locked. What kind of accident? The boy hesitated, looking down at the clipboard in his hands, as if it might contain a softer version of the truth. "You need to come with us to the station," he said. "There's an officer waiting to speak with you." I didn't move for a long time. Couldn't. My limbs refused to work. I tried to ask questions. What happened? How, when? But all I could manage was a choked whisper. "Is he okay?" He didn't answer. That was the answer. The drive down the mountain was a blur. I barely remember the winding roads or the flashing of hazard lights. The lodge SUV rattled with every turn, but I didn't feel it. All I could hear was white noise, like a static had settled in my ears and wouldn't leave. The station was small. Wooden beams. A receptionist with too much makeup and not enough empathy. She led me to a side room where a man in uniform waited, hat in his hands, eyes heavy with the kind of sadness you don't fake. His name was Officer Gaines. Middle-aged, quiet voice. He sat across from me and said the words I think I always feared but never believed I'd hear. "Your son, Daniel? He took his own life." Time didn't stop. It just slowed to a crawl. I didn't cry. Not then. Not when I should have. I asked for details. I needed something concrete. Something real to hang this impossible truth on. Officer Gaines hesitated, then pulled out a sealed plastic bag. Inside was a folded letter. "He left this," he said softly. "We debated sharing it with you tonight, but, well, he wrote it for you. Specifically." My hands were shaking as I reached for it. The paper felt too light, too fragile for something so heavy. I unfolded it carefully. His handwriting was still the same, slanted, lowercase, looping. My throat clenched at the sight of it. "Dad, I'm sorry. I know this will hurt you. I didn't want to do that, but I couldn't breathe anymore. Not at home. Not anywhere. It was always so quiet. But not the good kind of quiet. The kind where you walk on eggshells and wait for the next explosion. You and Mom fought without words. With your silences, your cold dinners, your closed doors. You stopped laughing. She stopped listening. I was just there, trying not to take sides. Trying to be invisible. But it didn't work. I still felt everything. I didn't understand how love could turn into that. Into pain. Into pressure. into something that made me feel like I was the reason you stayed when you both clearly wanted to leave. I know you loved me. I never doubted that. But you didn't love each other. And I think that slowly led me. I hope you understand. And I hope you forgive me. Daniel. I don't remember what I said after that. Or if I said anything. I just remember the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. Like a war drum in an empty cave. Mira arrived an hour later. She burst into the station, face red, makeup streaked. When she saw me, her body folded in on itself like paper set on fire. What happened? She whispered. I didn't answer. She repeated it louder. Caleb, what happened? I handed her the letter. She read it in silence, her mouth opening slightly with each line. Her hands trembled, and by the end, she couldn't hold the paper anymore. It fluttered to the floor. She sank to the bench beside me. No, she said. No. This can't be real. But it was. It was more real than anything had been in a long time. She sobbed beside me, rocking back and forth. At one point, she reached for my hand. I pulled it away. The numbness had settled too deeply. We drove back to the retreat that night, neither of us speaking. The SUV was silent. The roads were slick from a light rain that had started while we were inside. I watched it beat and streak down the window, wishing I could cry, not for her, not even for me, but for Daniel. But I couldn't. I felt hollow. Like grief had taken a shovel to my chest and carved out everything that used to live there. When we got back to the cabin, Mira collapsed onto the bed. I stood at the door for a long time, still in my coat, watching her. Her phone buzzed again. This time, I picked it up. Another message. Still thinking about last night. Can't stop. My jaw tightened. My hands shook. I set the phone back down gently. Didn't say a word. Instead, I walked into the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and splashed cold water onto my face. The mirror didn't recognize me. And honestly, neither did I. The funeral was held 3 days later in a small-town chapel. Daniel had never once stepped inside while alive. It wasn't what he would have wanted. He would have hated the formal suits, the dull hymns, the distant relatives acting like they knew him. But at that point, it wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what Mira needed to feel like a mother again. So I stood beside her in a stiff black tie while she clutched a white rose and whispered empty words about redemption and grace. I don't remember much of what was said. I remember the look on her face, carefully constructed grief, controlled sobs, and the way people murmured words like tragic and so young, like those phrases meant something. Like they were doing anything but filling the air with noise. I stood there like a prop. Not father. Not husband. Not even really a man anymore. Just a vessel carrying regret. After the service, I slipped away while Mira entertained condolences. I found myself standing by Daniel's casket, the lid still closed. I rested my hand on it, not out of ritual, but reflex, and whispered an apology that no one could hear but him. I should have taken you with me when I left, I said. It wasn't until we returned to the retreat that I realized Mira had no plans to leave early. Most couples would have packed their things, rushed home, canceled everything. Not Mira. She told the facilitators she needed this space to process. She told me he would have wanted us to finish this. I didn't respond. Not because I agreed, but because arguing with her now felt like throwing stones into the sea. She behaved as if nothing had happened. She smiled when spoken to. She laughed, not the deep, honest laugh she used to have, but a light, tinny version of it. One morning she brought me coffee like she used to, placed it beside my hand without a word. Another day she reached for my fingers during a breathing circle and held them as if everything between us hadn't turned to ash. I let her. Not because I forgave her, but because I didn't have the strength to pull away anymore. During group sessions, she shared about loss and perspective. She spoke of Daniel like he was a story she'd read once, like quoting him gave her a moral high ground. He taught us to slow down, she told the others. He showed us what happens when love is buried too deep. I wanted to laugh. Or scream. Or leave. But I didn't. Instead, I watched the other couples. I listened to their confessions, their arguments disguised as exercises. I watched a woman cry because her husband had forgotten their anniversary 3 years in a row. I saw a man break down because his wife hadn't touched him in 8 months. And in those moments I saw pieces of myself. Pieces of Mira. Pieces of the marriage we'd once tried to sculpt into something it was never designed to be. Every fake smile. Every carefully curated anecdote. Every time someone said, "We're working on it," I saw us. Or what we had been. And I wondered how many other people were pretending to. One night, during a guided meditation in the main lodge, I opened my eyes and looked around the room. Everyone else was still, breathing, searching for peace. But not me. I wasn't searching anymore. I had found it, not in forgiveness, not in understanding, but in clarity. Across from me, a woman I didn't know began to cry. Her shoulders shook silently, tears streaking down her cheeks. No one else noticed. Not even her husband, who sat beside her, eyes closed, lips parted in serene exhalation. And in that moment, I understood something that should have hit me years ago. Sometimes the body cries for what the mouth isn't allowed to say. That night, Mira came into our room and began folding laundry. She hummed softly to herself, something tuneless and familiar. After a while, she sat beside me on the bed and placed her hand on my thigh. "Tomorrow's our last day," she said. I didn't look at her. "I think we've made progress," she added, almost to herself. I stayed quiet. "You've been quieter than usual," she said, trying to sound light, but I could hear the edge beneath it. More internal. Reflective. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the trees swayed in the moonlight. The air was still. "I saw you," I said finally. She paused. "Saw me?" "On the third day. With him. Behind the admin building." The silence behind me thickened. "I saw everything," I said, turning slowly. "You kissed him. You held him like I haven't seen you hold me in years." Her face paled. Her mouth opened. Closed. I expected her to deny it. Or maybe to cry. But she did neither. Instead, she nodded. "I figured," she whispered. That was all. No excuses. No scrambling. Just quiet resignation. "What was the plan, Mira?" I asked. "To come here, let it run its course, and then what? Keep pretending? Keep hiding?" She didn't answer. "I think Daniel saw more than we thought," I continued. "I think he's been watching us fall apart for years. And we kept asking him to be okay with that. To carry it for us." She sat down, her face blank, empty. "I don't hate you," I said. I can't do this anymore." Still, no tears. No fight. Just silence. She reached for her sweater and stood. "I'm going for a walk," she said. I let her go. She didn't come back for hours. I didn't wait up. Instead, I lay in bed and listened to the wind return. It battered the windows, howled through the cracks. I pulled the blanket tighter and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't how I imagined things ending. Not with shouting. Not with slammed doors or broken furniture. Just stillness. A silence too loud to ignore. On our last night at the retreat, Mira tried to reclaim control. She oscillated between warmth and fury. One moment she pressed her head to my shoulder, whispering about second chances. The next, she was accusing me of giving up too easily, of letting grief warp my judgment. She paced the cabin, hands trembling, voice shaking with something that wasn't sadness, it was fear. Fear of consequences. Of being left behind. I said nothing. There was nothing left to defend. No illusion to preserve. The only thing between us now was the echo of what we used to be. "You're really going to throw it all away?" she asked, her voice cracking. I didn't respond. Because it had already been thrown away, long before the photo, long before the kiss. This wasn't the end. It was the final breath of something long dead. At dawn, while she slept curled on the far side of the bed, I packed my bag. Quietly. Deliberately. I didn't leave a note. I didn't wake her. I just sipped my duffel and walked out into the pale morning, the cold biting my fingers as I gripped the handle. No drama. No final argument. Just steps, quiet, steady, towards something that was mine again. I didn't know what lay ahead. Legal fights, probably. Loneliness. Silence. But I welcomed it. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't choosing comfort. I was choosing peace. 4 months later, I lived in Arizona. The air was dry, the sun relentless. I'd taken a job as a community college lecturer, teaching intro engineering to first years who still believed they had time to figure it all out. Most days, I admire them for that. For believing they had time. Each morning, I woke early, made a cup of coffee, and wrote a letter. To Daniel. I never mailed them. Never showed them to anyone. Just filled page after page with the things I never said while he was alive. I wrote about grief, about the silence he left behind, about the nights I still reached for my phone out of habit, half expecting a message. I wrote about Mira too, how she tried to call. How I didn't answer. How I couldn't. Sometimes I told him about the students, or the desert, or the way my hands still shook when I heard a teenage boy laugh with his father in the grocery store. I told him the truth. That I failed him. That I'd made choices, small ones, quiet ones, that added up to a childhood spent under tension. But I also promised him things. I promised I would live better. That I'd stop mistaking endurance for strength. That I'd choose honesty over peacekeeping. That I'd stop loving people who made me forget who I was. I never reached out to the retreat therapist. Even though I could have. Even though her voice had once cut through the fog like a lighthouse beam. It wasn't about a new woman. It wasn't about replacing anything. It was about rebuilding. Piece by piece. day by day, and remembering finally who I had been before everything went quiet.